I mean, I want to start today by pointing at this just giant glaring question mark right in the middle of our modern society.
Oh, yeah. The paradox.
Right, exactly. A paradox that you see everywhere.
Yeah.
From the news to, like, your own friend group.
Mm-hmm.
Why are modern relationships feeling like an absolute battlefield?
Yeah, it's everywhere. Yeah.
If you look at the raw data, the global marriage rate is just plummeting. The line on the graph is this steep dive downward.
While the unmarriage rate, the people choosing to stay completely single, is just skyrocketing.
Exactly. And you have to ask, well, why? We live in an era of, unprecedented material wealth. We have algorithms designed by literal geniuses to find us our perfect soulmate.
Right. All the tools for connection.
Yeah, every possible tool. And yet young people are looking at the institution of marriage, looking at the traditional family structure and saying, absolutely not.
They're rejecting it entirely.
Completely. The most intimate, tender space human beings share, the bedroom, our homes, is increasingly governed by this brutal, invisible logic of power. And we have to ask why.
It is arguably the defining social paradox of the 21st century. And, the reflex is always to just blame modernity.
Right, like we blame dating apps.
Exactly. We blame dating apps, we blame a failure of modern psychology, economic inflation, or we blame social media for ruining our attention spans.
It's always a surface-level excuse.
Right. But if we actually dig into the foundational logic of how human beings organize themselves, like if we strip away the surface-level noise, we find this structural mechanism that has been operating quietly in the background for tens of thousands of years.
And that hidden mechanism is exactly what we are exposing today. We are taking a deep dive into a text that fundamentally inverts how we understand gender, love, and power.
It really flips everything upside down.
It does. It's a book that predicted the exact relationship anxieties you are seeing today, but it did so over half a century ago. We are exploring Shulamith Firestone's explosive 1970 book, The Dialectic of Sex.
A monumental piece of writing.
And I need to set the stage here, because this isn't just a book about getting a pay raise or putting more women on corporate boards.
No, not at all.
Firestone wrote this at the age of 25. She was a founding member of the radical feminist movement in New York groups, like the Red Stockings.
Which were incredibly militant for the time.
Super militant.
Yeah.
And her thesis was nothing short of a theoretical bomb. She argued that the oppression of women isn't just a cultural habit, it is a biological reality.
Right.
And she basically said that true liberation requires the complete overthrow of the biological foundation of humanity itself.
It is a breathtakingly ambitious text. I mean, at 25 years old, Firestone was looking at the two great titans of 20th century thought.
Marx and Freud.
Exactly. Karl Marx, who explained the world through economics, and Sigmund Freud, who explained the world through psychology. And she essentially concluded that both of them were brilliant, but both of them were fundamentally incomplete.
Like they were missing a huge piece of the puzzle.
Right. She believed she had found the missing link between the two. A single, unified theory that could explain why human history is just so drenched in inequality and exploitation.
Now, before we start unpacking this really dense and, frankly, highly provocative architecture of thought, I have to state our mission for this deep dive very clearly.
Yes, definitely a good idea.
Our job is to decode this text so you, the listener, can understand one of the most historically significant and radical pieces of literature of the modern era. Firestone's ideas are intensely politically charged.
Very much so.
They attack institutions that people hold absolutely sacred. So we, as your hosts, are acting strictly as impartial guides.
We are just the messengers here.
Exactly. We're not endorsing her views. We are not taking sides on any of the political, social, or historical arguments she presents. Our sole purpose is to map out her exact blueprint, neutrally and objectively, so you can see how her logic flows.
And it does flow with a very brutal logic.
It really does. So with that out of the way, I want to start where she starts. Let's rewind history and look at what she considers the ultimate intellectual blind spot.
Yes. The logical place to begin is with her critique of Karl Marx. Because Firestone respects Marx immensely, she actually utilizes his analytical tools.
But she essentially taps him on the shoulder and says, you didn't dig deep enough.
That's exactly it.
Right. And I want to pause here because I need you to explain this clearly. Most of us absorb this general idea, even if we've never read Marx, that economics is the root of everything.
Right. The money, the class struggle.
Yeah, money, capitalism, who owns the factories, the division of labor.
Mm-hmm.
We were taught that if you trace any inequality down to its absolute bedrock, you find a dollar sign.
That's the standard historical view, yes.
But Firestone says no.
Yeah.
She claims Marx missed something much older and much deeper.
Right. To understand her critique, we have to briefly look at the tool Marx used, which is called historical materialism.
Which sounds super academic.
It does, but stripped of the jargon, historical materialism is just the idea that the way a society organizes its physical material survival dictates absolutely everything else about that society.
Okay.
It dictates its laws, its religion, its culture, and its power structures. Marx looked at history and said, well, the fundamental material reality is the production of goods. Who owns the land? Who owns the tools?
Who owns the factories?
Exactly. The people who own those things form the ruling class, and the people who just sell their labor form the oppressed class.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about who controls the means of production. So where does Firestone think he went wrong?
Well, Firestone argues that Marx started his analysis way too late in the timeline of human existence. Production goods is important, sure, but before you can produce goods, you have to produce the producers.
Oh, wow.
Right, you have to reproduce the human species itself. Firestone introduces what she calls the biological sex class.
The biological sex class. That's a huge phrase.
It is. She argues that beneath the economic layer of society, beneath the kings and peasants, beneath the CEOs and the factory workers, there is a foundational biological substratum.
So the oldest class system in human history isn't based on who owns the plow.
No, it's based on who physically bears the children.
That is a massive paradigm shift. Because she's essentially saying that economic oppression is just a symptom. The physiological difference between men and women is the actual motherboard of all exploitation.
Exactly. She builds this three-dimensional model of historical dialectics. She says you have to look at how class evolved, from nomadic tribes to modern capitalism, and you have to look at how culture evolved.
Right, from primitive religion to modern technology.
Right. But running parallel to both of those, driving them forward, is the evolution of sex and reproduction. And you cannot understand the first two without understanding that third one.
So let's look at that third rail. Because she doesn't just make a vague philosophical claim. She breaks down what she calls the biological family into four inescapable physical pillars.
Yes, and these are very tangible.
And I have to admit, reading these pillars is incredibly sobering. Because we tend to think of historical sexism as men just decided to be cruel and dominating. But she points out that it was, for most of history, a brutal biological inevitability.
Precisely. You know, we romanticize nature today. We think of it as this beautiful, harmonious thing. But Firestone insists that nature is inherently oppressive.
That is such a slap in the face to how we usually think.
It really is. The biological family is not a harmonious partnership in her view. It is an inherently unequal power distribution dictated by biology. Let's look at pillar number one.
Okay, lay it out.
The physical reality of the female body prior to modern science.
And we really have to emphasize prior to modern science, because it's so easy for us today, with our pharmacies and our medical care, to forget what the baseline of human existence actually was.
Exactly. For the vast, overwhelming majority of human history, reliable birth control simply did not exist. Therefore, women were at the continual, unrelenting mercy of their reproductive biology.
We are talking about the physical exhaustion of near-constant pregnancies.
Right. The onset of menstruation, the very real life-threatening danger of childbirth, and then the endless years of nursing.
You were essentially hijacked by the survival needs of the species.
We were.
Your body was not your own. You couldn't opt out.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads directly to her second pillar, which is the nature of human infants themselves.
Which is very unique in the animal kingdom.
Right. If you look at a horse, it gives birth, and the foal is standing up and walking within an hour.
That's incredible.
But a human infant is terrifyingly helpless. It takes years of intense, constant, 24-hour physical care just to keep a human child alive until it can minimally fend for itself.
Which logically forces the creation of pillar number 3.
Okay, what's that?
A total, almost pathological interdependency between mother and child.
Wow. Pathological?
Yeah, because the infant is utterly helpless, right?
Oh.
The mother is biologically tied to feeding and caring for it, usually while pregnant with the next child at the same time.
So she's trapped.
Exactly. This dynamic forges extreme dependence. Because the mother is anchored to the infant, her mobility is restricted. Her ability to gather food or defend herself is compromised.
So she needs someone else.
Right. Therefore, she becomes entirely dependent on others, historically, the physically stronger males, for her own physical and economic survival.
And there the trap snaps shut. Because that dependence creates pillar number 4, The very first division of labor in human history.
It wasn't a choice.
No. It wasn't that humans sat around a campfire and did a skills assessment and decided men were better at hunting and women were better at gathering.
Right, like a corporate retreat.
No,
Yeah.
exactly. It was a division of labor dictated entirely by reproductive biology. Men were unencumbered. They were free to move, to build, to invent, to conquer, and most importantly, to organize.
While women were geographically and physically anchored by the biological reality of reproduction.
And because the men were the ones interacting with the broader world, securing the resources and developing the tools of survival, they naturally accumulated the structural power.
The biological family, therefore, is the exact blueprint of a class system.
That makes so much sense when you frame it like that.
Right. You have one class, women who are biologically conscripted into the unpaid, physically demanding labor of reproduction, and another class, men who control the resources and the power.
Now, I want to push back here because when I first read this, my immediate thought went to something you see pop up in history books and documentaries all the time.
I think I know where you're going.
What about the ancient matriarchies? We constantly hear about these ancient goddess-worshipping cultures where women supposedly ruled society and everything was peaceful and egalitarian before violent patriarchal tribes took over.
The Golden Age myth.
Yeah. Doesn't that prove that biology isn't destiny?
Well, Firestone anticipates this exact argument, and her dismantling of it is ruthless. She states unequivocally that the ancient matriarchy, as a political utopia of female power, is a complete myth.
Wait, explain that, because it feels like a massive contradiction to popular feminist history.
It comes down to confusing how a society tracks its lineage with who actually holds the power in that society.
Okay, unpack that.
Firestone points out that in primitive societies, before anyone understood the precise biological mechanics of paternity, and certainly before DNA testing, the mother was the only certain verifiable parent.
Right, you always knew who the mother was because you saw her give birth.
Exactly. Therefore, it was practically necessary to track descent, inheritance, and tribal affiliation through the maternal line.
So tracking descent through the mother was just an accounting system.
That's all it was. It was an administrative necessity. But matrilineal descent did not equate to matriarchal power. The men still held the physical power, they still controlled the primary resources, and the women were still subjected to the brutal physical realities of the four pillars we just discussed.
So it's an illusion.
Completely. Firestone argues that worshiping a woman as a fertility goddess is not the same thing as granting women political or economic freedom.
In fact, she says it's basically a trap.
Right. It's often a psychological mechanism to pacify them. You put the woman on a pedestal, you revere her ability to give birth, but you keep her locked firmly inside the biological prison.
So to use an analogy, it's like looking at Marx's economic theory and saying, well, some factories have a picture of the workers on the wall, therefore the workers run the factory.
Perfect analogy. No, the boss still owns the factory. The accounting system doesn't change the underlying reality.
Firestone is essentially saying that trying to fix inequality without addressing biology is like a mechanic trying to fix a deep software glitch in your car's computer by changing the tires.
Exactly.
You can change the tires, you can redistribute the wealth, you can worship the tires as goddesses, but if the underlying biological software still dictates that women are uniquely tied to reproduction and therefore dependent, the inequality will just reboot itself in a new form.
That is the precise logic. And to prove that changing the tires doesn't fix the software, she directs us to look at history. She asks us to examine the moments when women actually tried to break out of this system politically.
And this brings us to her fascinating and honestly deeply tragic analysis of the early feminist movement in America and why she believes it ultimately failed. This part of the book really challenges the baseline assumptions we are taught in school. We are taught that the 1920s, when women finally won the right to vote after 52 years of exhausting, brutal struggle, was this triumphant pinnacle victory.
The ultimate success story.
Yeah, the big win. But Firestone looks at the 19th Amendment and says, no, getting the vote was a disaster.
It is a totally counterintuitive take. I mean, how can gaining a fundamental democratic right be a disaster?
It sounds crazy.
It does. But to understand her reasoning, you have to look back at what the early radical feminists in the 19th century, women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, were actually demanding when the movement started.
Right, because they weren't just politely asking for a ballot?
Not at all. If you read Stanton's The Woman's Bible or look at their early writings, they were attacking the foundational institutions of society.
They were going after everything.
They were critiquing the patriarchal structure of the church. They were attacking the legal framework of traditional marriage, which literally legally subsumed a woman's identity into her husband's.
Like you couldn't even own property.
Exactly. They were questioning the absolute authority of the father and demanding true economic independence. They were, to use your analogy, trying to rewrite the software.
But then what happened? Because obviously we didn't get that revelation.
The resistance they met from the establishment was so fierce, so deeply entrenched, and so exhausting over decades that the movement slowly began to compromise.
They got tired.
They did. They needed broader support, so they narrowed their focus. They convinced themselves strategically, okay, if we just secure the right to vote, we'll have the political leverage to change all those other deep structural things later.
Ah. So the vote transitioned from being one tool among many to becoming the single all-consuming goal of the entire movement.
And Firestone argues that by pouring all of that radical revolutionary energy into one narrow reformist goal, they let the underlying system off the hook.
This system basically looked at this massive pressure building up, and it opened a release valve.
Precisely.
It said, fine, here's a piece of paper. You can drop it in a box every 4 years to choose which man governs you. Now go back home.
And the profound tragedy, according to Firestone, is that it worked.
It worked perfectly. The radical demands for fundamentally changing the family structure, for achieving true economic autonomy, for rethinking the biological destiny of women, all of that was swallowed whole by the ballot box.
Once the vote was achieved in 1920, the urgency just dissipated. The feminist movement essentially collapsed and died for the next 50 years.
She calls this period from 1920 to 1970 the 50-year ridicule.
A great term for it.
Because once the explicit legal barrier to voting was removed, society didn't actually become equal. The underlying cultural and economic barriers just adapted. They mutated and tightened their grip in more insidious ways.
She outlines the evolution of women's roles through these decades, and it is a masterclass in how a power structure reasserts itself when threatened.
Let's trace that evolution because it perfectly illustrates her point. You start with the 1920s. Immediately after the vote is won, the era of the flapper.
Right. Culturally, we remember the flapper as a symbol of liberated, free-spirited womanhood.
Short hair, dancing.
Exactly. But Firestone analyzes it differently. She argues that the 1920s is when the massive commodification and eroticization of women really took off. Women were, in her terms, reprivatized through sex appeal.
Because the definition of liberation shifted. It was no longer about political power or economic independence. It was redefined as the freedom to wear shorter skirts, cut your hair, and buy cosmetics.
Yes. Liberation became a personal, consumerist pursuit rather than a collective political threat.
The energy of the revolution was redirected into the department store.
Precisely. Then you move into the 1930s, the Great Depression. The harsh economic reality forces a massive regression.
Right. People are starving.
Jobs are scarce, and the societal pressure is immense for women to step aside, abandon their careers, and leave the limited jobs for the male breadwinners. The frivolous, independent flapper image vanishes, replaced by a defensive, guilt-ridden posture.
But then the 1940s hit, World War II breaks out, and suddenly the system has a massive labor shortage.
Yes, so temporarily, the cultural narrative flips again. Women are suddenly granted full human status and capability. They are urged to go into the factories, to build the bombers, to manage the logistics of the war effort.
Rosie the Riveter.
Exactly. And they prove definitively and undeniably that they are fully capable of executing any complex, demanding job a man can do.
Which creates a terrifying problem for the system when the war ends in 1945. The men come home, and the society is flush with highly competent, financially independent women who have tasted autonomy.
So what do you do?
Right. How do you force that genie back into the bottle? How do you get them back into the biological family structure?
You invent a new, highly sophisticated cultural apparatus. You launch the 1950s. You sell them the suburban dream.
This is the era of the feminine mystique, as Betty Friedan famously called it. The system literally builds millions of isolated suburban homes, fills them with shiny new consumer appliances, the new vacuum, the washing machine, and markets this isolation as the ultimate luxury.
This is the dark, anti-intuitive realization Firestone wants the reader to grasp. Gaining formal legal equality, the vote in a system that is still fundamentally capitalist and patriarchal, actually resulted in women becoming more psychologically miserable.
Because it was a trap.
Because the system teamed up to sell an illusion of liberation. It isolated women in these individual suburban boxes. It stripped them of the communal networks of the city.
You were clearly alone.
And it bombarded them with propaganda stating that their highest possible intellectual and emotional calling was to be a creative mother and a perfect consumer.
So wait, let me make sure I'm synthesizing this correctly. Winning the right to vote was actually the system's way of hitting the mute button on the revolution.
Yeah.
It pacified the political threat with a legal concession, and then used consumerism and suburban isolation as an anesthetic to replace actual structural freedom.
That is exactly the mechanism. If you are geographically isolated in a suburban house, if you are spending your days buying products to make yourself more attractive and pouring all of your intellectual and emotional energy into hyper-focusing on your children, you are not organizing.
You don't have the time or energy.
Right. You are not a political threat. You are entirely neutralized.
But human beings aren't stupid. If you take an entire class of intelligent, capable people and lock them in a gilded cage of domesticity, that energy has to go somewhere. The misery doesn't just evaporate. Where does it go?
It gets turned violently inward. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating sections of the book, Firestone's explosive critique of psychoanalysis, and specifically her complex relationship with Sigmund Freud.
I was so surprised by this section, because Freud is often viewed by modern feminists as the ultimate patriarch, the guy who invented penis envy and blamed everything on women's biology.
Oh, absolutely. He's usually the villain.
But Firestone actually defends Freud initially, before completely dismantling his legacy.
Yes, she argues that Freud was actually a genius observer of reality. He wasn't making things up out of thin air. He was listening to his patients, mostly upper-middle-class women in Vienna who were suffering from terrible hysteria, deep depression, and severe neuroses.
And he correctly observed the symptoms of patriarchal oppression.
He did. He realized their suffering was rooted in deep, unfulfilled desires and massive societal repression.
So he diagnosed the disease perfectly. But his cure was the actual poison.
Precisely. Freud observed the profound sickness of the society his patients lived in. But because he was a product of his time, he assumed that the patriarchal society was the immovable, natural baseline of reality.
Like he couldn't imagine a world without it.
Right. Therefore, his logical conclusion was that if the patient is unhappy in the natural society, it is the patient who is fundamentally broken.
Therapy became a mechanism of domestication. Instead of the therapist saying, wow, you are a deeply intelligent, capable human being trapped in a suffocating, powerless role. No wonder you're losing your mind. You should organize and rebel against this sick society.
Which would be the radical response.
Right. Instead of that, the psychoanalyst said, your desire to rebel is a symptom of your illness. You need to adjust. You need to accept your natural biological role.
The therapist's couch literally replaced the protest march. It took a collective political grievance and individualized it into a personal psychological failure.
That is the tragedy of psychoanalysis, according to Firestone. It neutralized the political energy of women by telling them their anger was a disease. And the absolute cornerstone of this domestication process, the core theory that enforced it, is how Freud interpreted the nuclear family.
Specifically through the Oedipus complex.
Okay, listener, I need you to brace yourself, because this is where Firestone takes a concept you think you know and turns it completely inside out.
Get ready for a massive paradigm shift.
We all know the pop culture cocktail party version of the Oedipus complex. Freud said little boys have a subconscious, repressed, sexual desire to kill their fathers and marry their mothers.
Which always sounds incredibly weird, highly literal, and vaguely mythological.
Yeah, it's very strange.
But Firestone argues that we have been distracted by the literal sexual interpretation. She asserts that the Oedipus complex isn't fundamentally about sex at all.
No.
No, it is about pure, unadulterated power politics. It is the child's first introduction to the microfascism of the nuclear family.
Let's break down this power triangle, because when she lays out the math of it, it makes terrifying sense. You have three actors in the traditional biological family: the father, the mother, and the child. What is the actual power dynamic operating between them?
Well, let's look at the resources. The father represents the outside world. In the traditional structure, he holds the economic power, he holds the physical strength, and he holds the ultimate legal and moral authority.
He is the sovereign.
The sovereign, yes. The mother, on the other hand, is the oppressed class within the home. She is economically and physically dependent on the father.
Right.
Because she lacks real objective power, she cannot simply command things to happen. Therefore, to influence her environment, she has to resort to indirect methods.
Emotional manipulation, pleading, wiles, tears.
Exactly. She has to manage the father's moods to survive. And then you have the child, who enters this dynamic at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy.
The child is physically tiny,
Yeah.
entirely economically dependent, and completely helpless.
Right.
So imagine you are a normal, highly observant kid growing up inside this triangle. Firestone says that right around age 5 or 6, the child, and she focuses specifically on the young boy here to explain patriarchal inheritance, starts to figure out the actual political reality of his household.
He reads the room.
He does. He looks at his mother. He loves her deeply. She is his primary caregiver. They share an intimate bond, largely because they are both oppressed by the absolute authority of the father.
They are comrades in a way.
Yeah. But the boy also realizes something crucial and terrifying. His mother is fundamentally powerless.
If the father gets truly angry, or if the father decides to withhold resources, the mother cannot protect the child. Her emotional manipulation is no match for his absolute power.
And this is the critical juncture. This is the moment the software is installed. The young boy realizes that if he wants to survive, and if he eventually wants to gain power and autonomy himself, he cannot remain politically aligned with the helpless, dependent mother.
Exactly. He is forced to make a brutal political calculus. He has to abandon his deep, empathetic, emotional connection with the mother, and he has to align himself with the father.
In psychology, this is called identifying with the aggressor.
Right.
So the 6-year-old isn't some tiny romantic with a weird incestuous crush on his mom. He's a tiny Machiavelli.
Yes.
He is realizing he needs to side with the boss to ensure his own survival.
That is precisely Firestone's reading. The boy represses his empathy for the mother. He actively rejects the feminine traits she embodies, emotional vulnerability, dependency, softness, because he recognizes them as signs of weakness and subjugation.
So he copies the dad.
He adopts the masculine traits of the father, rationality, authority, detachment, dominance, because that is the only path to eventual power. He makes a subconscious political bargain.
I'm basically saying, I will submit to your authority now, father, and I will reject the mother so that one day I can inherit your position and become the sovereign oppressor myself.
And she argues this is the exact moment where men are structurally conditioned to lose their capacity to truly vulnerably love, which is a massive point we will dissect later.
But for now, just think about how radical this reinterpretation is. She takes Freud's most famous psychological concept and turns it into a blueprint for a dictatorship.
That's a great way to put it.
The nuclear family isn't some natural haven of love and warmth. It is a brutal, high-stakes boot camp where human beings are systematically trained in the dynamics of dominance and submission.
And if the family is indeed a rigid, unyielding power hierarchy, we have to ask the next logical question.
What's that?
What does that mean for the people who are permanently stuck at the very bottom of that hierarchy? What does it mean for the children?
This blew my mind. We were actually just talking about this earlier before we sat down to the microphones. If you thought her take on marriage was intense, her take on kids completely shatters reality, because she argues that childhood itself is a myth.
Yes. In this section, Firestone leans heavily on the groundbreaking work of the French historian Philippe Ariès. She delivers another massive, anti-intuitive point.
Lay it on us.
Childhood, as we understand it today, as a distinct, segregated, extended phase of life, defined by innocence, play, and absolute helplessness, did not exist in the Middle Ages.
It is an entirely modern invention.
Completely invented.
Wait, I'm struggling to wrap my head around this. Obviously, people in the 14th century gave birth to tiny humans. How could childhood not exist? What did a 7-year-old's life actually look like day to day if they weren't a child?
Well, of course, biological immaturity existed. But the culture of childhood did not. In the Middle Ages, as soon as a young human was physically capable of surviving without constant nursing, say, around age 6 or 7, they were integrated directly into the adult world.
So they weren't sequestered in a playroom?
Not at all. They played the same games as adults. They wore miniature versions of the exact same clothing. They worked alongside adults in the fields or in trades, and they socialized in the same spaces.
They were just part of life.
Right. They were exposed to the same raw realities of life, death, economics, and sex. There was no special children's literature, no separate children's language, no concept of shielding their innocence. They were viewed simply as small, less experienced adults who were part of the broader community.
So when did we invent this modern concept of childhood, and more importantly, why?
Firestone argues it was invented in tandem with the rise of the modern nuclear family and industrial capitalism.
How so?
As work moved out of the communal village and into factories and specialized offices, the family structure shifted. It became a private, isolated, enclosed unit, And within that new unit, children transition from being economic assets like helping on the farm to becoming economic liabilities.
It could cost money to raise.
Exactly.
And to justify keeping them dependent and under the absolute authoritarian control of the parents for longer and longer periods, well into their late teen society, had to invent an ideology.
The ideology of childhood.
We had to invent the belief that young people are uniquely fragile, fundamentally irrational, asexual, and in need of constant microscopic supervision.
And what is the ultimate institution created by modern society to enforce this supervision and extend this dependence?
The modern school system.
Yes, Firestone's analysis of school is absolutely scathing. She argues that the primary function of the modern school is not education. It is a mild, meticulous, highly regulated prison.
Think about the actual mechanics of how school works.
Yeah.
It is profoundly unnatural.
Very unnatural.
For the first 18 years of your life, the system mandates that you only associate with people manufactured in the exact same 12-month window as you.
Right.
You are a third grader,
Yeah.
and you are strictly segregated from the fifth graders. We treat children like batches of industrial products on an assembly line, moving them from station to station, grade to grade, rather than treating them like individual humans integrating into a diverse community.
And this strict, arbitrary age segregation creates bizarre, artificial internal hierarchies.
Like, who is the most popular in the 8th grade? Who's the best at sports in this specific age bracket?
Exactly. Firestone argues this intense microculture distracts them from recognizing their shared oppression by the adult class.
Wow.
Furthermore, she points out that a vast amount of the actual curriculum is essentially busy work. The goal isn't to impart crucial survival skills or deep philosophical understanding. The goal is custodial.
To keep them busy.
It is designed to keep them occupied, physically contained, and to extend their period of economic and psychological dependence on the family for as long as humanly possible.
It's a mechanism for breaking the will to be independent. You spend 12 years being trained to sit silently at a desk, to obey bells, to ask permission from an authority figure just to use the bathroom, to accept arbitrary grading systems.
It's true.
Why? So that by the time you graduate at 18, your spirit is perfectly conditioned to accept a subordinate, compliant role in the broader capitalist economy and to unthinkingly recreate the nuclear family structure yourself. It is social control disguised as education.
It is a profound mechanism of domestication. So, just to recap the architecture of her theory so far, we've seen how this biological power dynamic operates in the intimate space of the bedroom, how it swallowed the political revolution at the voting booth, how it uses the therapist's couch to individualize systemic trauma, and how it uses the classroom to break the autonomy of the young.
It is so comprehensive.
It is. Now, Firestone does something incredibly ambitious. She takes this exact same psychological template, the power dynamics of the nuclear family, and scales it up to explain global macro-societal evils.
She goes even bigger.
She addresses racism not as a separate phenomenon, but as the ultimate macro-patriarchy.
Now, I want to reiterate our strict neutrality here. What we are about to outline is Firestone's highly specific structural model. We're not endorsing it as the definitive explanation for the complexities of global racism.
Of course not.
But we're going to lay out her exact argument because it is the linchpin of her grand unified theory of how human psychology processes power.
Yes. She calls this model the eternal triangle of race. Firestone argues that racism is not merely a byproduct of economic exploitation or a separate historical anomaly.
Okay.
She views it as a massive macro-level projection of the deeply ingrained sexist family dynamic we just analyzed. She literally maps the roles of the nuclear family onto the racial dynamics of America.
How does that mapping work? Who plays what role in her model?
In her framework, the white man acts as the all-powerful father of the macro society. He holds the ultimate economic capital, the political machinery, and the physical force of the state. He is the sovereign.
Okay. The white woman, then, is positioned as his protected property. The wife.
Exactly.
She shares in the racial privilege of the father. She lives in the big house, but she remains fundamentally subordinate to his gender. She's placed on a pedestal of purity, ostensibly protected by the system, but she is powerless in her own right. She is an extension of his status.
Then, Firestone argues, the black man is treated by this macro system as the rebellious, threatening son.
Wow. Back to the Oedipus dynamic.
Right. Just as the father in the Fordian nuclear family feels a subconscious existential threat from the son who will eventually grow up to challenge his absolute power, The macro patriarchy views the black man as a constant, latent threat to its authority.
So they repress him.
Therefore, the system goes to extraordinary, often violently oppressive lengths to keep him marginalized, to politically, economically, and sometimes literally castrate his power to prevent him from usurping the father.
And finally, that leaves the black woman who is forced into the role of the degraded labor and sexual outlet. Because the white woman is artificially elevated as the pure, untouchable wife, the system requires an other to bear the brunt of the most degrading physical labor, and to serve as an outlet for the exploitation the father cannot inflict on his pure wife.
The core unifying insight Firestone is driving at here is that racism is essentially sexism extended. She is arguing that the underlying psychology of racism, the deeply pathological human need to categorize people by biological traits, to establish a rigid hierarchy of worth, and to violently dominate an other, originates in the fundamental unaddressed power imbalances of the biological family.
Let me make sure I'm translating this correctly. She's basically saying, look, if you grow up your entire life in a household where the very foundation of reality is based on physical differences, men dominating women, adults dominating children, you are psychologically primed to accept a society where power is based on racial differences.
Yes.
You've already accepted the premise that biology dictates destiny and hierarchy.
That is exactly it. If you have internalized a master and subordinate dynamic in your own living room from the age of 0, translating that dynamic to the broader society based on skin color is a seamless psychological step.
That's terrifying.
It is. That is why Firestone insists that until you destroy the root cause, the sexual class system, you will never truly eradicate racism or classism or any other form of systemic exploitation. The psychological template for domination will simply find a new biological trait to exploit.
It is an incredibly dark, heavy, almost suffocating diagnosis. I mean, if the system is this pervasive, if it infects our families, our schools, our politics, and our racial dynamics, the obvious question is, why do we stay in it?
Why not rebel?
Right. Why aren't human beings constantly revolting against this structure? And Firestone's answer to this is perhaps the most painful, anti-intuitive part of the entire book.
Yeah.
We stay in it because we are sedated by the ultimate cultural anesthetic,
Right.
romance. Firestone dedicates a significant portion of the book to deconstructing romantic love, and her conclusions are absolutely brutal. She argues that in a system of unequal power, pure love simply cannot exist.
Now, I want to clarify, she isn't a total sociopath here. She isn't saying that human affection doesn't exist, or that humans don't have a genuine, healthy psychological need for connection and warmth.
Right. She's not a robot.
No, she acknowledges the human need for connection. But she argues that what we culturally define and pursue as romantic love is profoundly corrupted by the sex class system. It is a mutated transactional version of affection. Let's look at the asymmetry of it. How does the man experience love versus how the woman experiences love in a patriarchy?
According to Firestone, for the man who holds the structural, economic, and physical power is fundamentally about possession.
It's an acquisition.
It is an extension of his ego. He acquires a woman to validate his masculinity, to serve his domestic and sexual needs, and to bear his heirs. His love is conditional. It is contingent on her remaining in her subordinate, supportive role.
And for the woman, this is the part that is particularly difficult to read because it strips away all the poetry we wrap around relationships.
It really does.
Firestone says female love is often a desperate, subconscious survival tactic. Think about the mechanics. If you were born into the weaker class in a society, deprived of direct economic leverage and political power, what is your only viable currency?
Your emotional labor and your sexuality.
Exactly.
So you trade that currency. You love the strong man in exchange for the economic shelter and physical security he can provide in a hostile world. Are you saying she views traditional marriage essentially as an emotional protection racket?
Essentially, yes. She writes that women are culturally conditioned from birth to pour all of their intellectual and emotional energy into seeking this romantic salvation, because they are systematically barred from seeking actual structural salvation, which would be acquiring political and economic power of their own.
And the system doesn't just rely on instinct. It uses a massive multi-billion-dollar apparatus, what she calls the culture of romance, to keep this dynamic functioning. She lists 3 specific mechanisms, and once you hear them, you see them everywhere. Mechanism number 1, eroticism.
Eroticism, in Firestone's view, is the channeling of the broad, diffuse human need for physical affection and intimacy into a very narrow, highly charged genital focus.
Right.
It reduces human beings, and almost exclusively women, to sexual objects. It turns connection into a performance, a commodity to be consumed.
Mechanism number 2, the privatization of women. We touched on this with the 1950 suburbs. The system constantly reinforces the narrative that your relationship is entirely private and completely unique.
Oh, you and your husband are different. Your love story is special.
Exactly. By convincing women that their situation is a private individual romance, the system prevents them from seeing that they actually share a collective political condition. If your misery is just a personal failure to find the right guy, you don't unionize with other women to change the system.
And mechanism number 3, the beauty ideal. This is perhaps the most insidious, and it functions as a literal tax.
A tax.
The culture promotes an arbitrary, ever-shifting, often physically unattainable standard of beauty. And women are encouraged to express their individuality by purchasing clothes, makeup, diets, and surgical procedures to reach this ideal.
But the cruel irony, and this is such a brilliant observation, is that it creates a fake standard of individuality. Everyone is buying slightly different shades of the exact same lipstick to look identically oppressed.
It is brilliant in a very dark way.
And I want to dig into the actual math of this beauty ideal, because it's not just about vanity, it's an economic and temporal tax. If a woman is socially required to spend an hour a day and thousands of dollars a year on cosmetics, hair care, and fashion, just to reach a baseline of societal acceptability in the workplace or the dating market, that is time and capital she is biologically forced to spend.
Time and capital that her male counterparts can instead invest in education, wealth building, or political organizing.
The lipstick isn't just makeup. It's a financial and temporal drain mechanism designed to keep her at a deficit.
It is a genius way to ensure the subordinate class exhausts its own resources. Furthermore, Firestone points out a massive cultural schism that occurs because of this dynamic. Because men possess the structural power, they laid claim to the technological mode of culture. They claimed science, rationality, objectivity, and engineering. They became the builders and the thinkers.
And women were restricted to the aesthetic mode: emotion, art, romance, intuition, and caregiving.
And Firestone argues this gendered split makes our entire civilization profoundly sick. Science without humanity, driven purely by the male ego, becomes cold, destructive, and capable of building atomic bombs and polluting rivers without a second of moral hesitation.
While art and emotion, divorced from real power and material reality, become frivolous, escapist, and completely incapable of changing the world.
Yep.
So basically, every time women get close to realizing they are an oppressed class, society hits them with a tidal wave of romantic comedies, Valentine's Day advertisements, wedding magazines, and diet culture.
Keep them distracted.
All designed to convince them their problems are just personal flaws. You're not politically oppressed, you just haven't found the right moisturizer, lost those 5 pounds, and met the right guy yet.
That is exactly the mechanism. Romance is the velvet glove over the iron fist of the biological family. It makes the prison feel like a sanctuary.
Okay, we've reached the bottom. We have diagnosed the disease, we have traced it down to its biological roots, walked through the historical failures of reform, exposed the psychology of childhood and racism, and stripped away the anesthetic of romance. Is a very bleak picture.
Very bleak.
What is Firestone's radical cure? How do we fix a system that is seemingly built into our very DNA?
This brings us to the final and most speculative part of her thesis, the ultimate revolution. And it is breathtaking in its scope. Firestone does not ask for reform. She demands a total structural reconstruction of reality.
A total overhaul.
Yes. And interestingly, before she gets to technology, she starts by linking feminism directly to ecology.
Right. I found this connection fascinating. She notes that both the ecological crisis, the rapid destruction of the planet, and the oppression of women stem from the exact same psychological root. It is the patriarchal, ego-driven obsession with dominating, conquering, and exploiting nature.
Men conquered nature to build civilization, and in doing so, they conquered the natural biological reality of women. Firestone argues that to save the planet from ecological collapse and to liberate women, that entire underlying mindset of domination and ownership has to be overthrown.
You cannot have a sustainable Earth as long as the psychology of exploitation is bred into the nuclear family.
Exactly.
But here's a wild card. Firestone doesn't say we should abandon technology and go back to living in caves. She says we have to go forward, through technology. She introduces what we can call the technological tipping point.
Yes. Remember, she is writing this in 1970. She is watching the dawn of advanced computing, what she calls cybernetics, the application of feedback loops and technology to biological and social systems.
And crucially, she is watching the development of reliable oral contraception and the very early theoretical discussions of artificial reproduction and artificial wombs.
She realized that for the first time in the entire history of the human species, the technology was emerging that could completely, definitively free women from the physical burden of pregnancy.
But she issues a massive warning. She says this technology is a double-edged sword. In the hands of the current patriarchal system, technology like artificial wombs or advanced genetic engineering leads to a dystopian nightmare.
Oh, absolutely.
It becomes the ultimate tool for men to control reproduction entirely, rendering women completely obsolete or turning them into mere biological raw material. Think of a horrific mix between The Handmaid's Tale and The Matrix.
But in the hands of a radical feminist revolution, that exact same technology is the key to true ultimate freedom. It is the only way to shatter pillar number one, the biological tyranny of reproduction.
So she lays out a blueprint. The 4 demands for the ultimate revolution. And I want us to really debate these because they sound like science fiction, but they are her logical conclusion. Demand 1, free women from the tyranny of biology.
This is the foundation. It means the full societal embrace, funding, and utilization of artificial reproduction. It means reliable, universally accessible contraception.
And it means the total sharing of the childbearing and child-rearing roles across the entire society, completely divorcing childcare from biological sex.
A man is just as responsible for raising a child as a woman because neither of them physically gave birth to it.
Demand 2, total economic independence for women and children. What does economic independence for children even look like?
It requires a massive restructuring of the economy, what she envisioned as a form of cybernetic socialism. If work is largely automated by technology, the wealth generated by those machines must be distributed universally.
So basic income, basically.
Yes. This means no individual, neither a woman nor a child, is economically dependent on the goodwill or the paycheck of a father for their basic survival. A child has a right to housing, food, and resources simply by existing, not conditionally through their parents.
Which leads to demand 3, complete integration of children into society.
This means destroying the concept of childhood as a segregated, supervised prison. It means dismantling the modern school system as we know it.
Children would be allowed to participate in the broader community and interact with all age groups, learn through actual experience in the world, and possess legal rights and autonomy commensurate with their actual abilities, not restricted by an arbitrary age cutoff.
And finally, demand 4, total sexual freedom.
Okay, what does she mean by that?
Her logic here is that once the biological family is dismantled, the rigid boundaries of heteronormativity, strict monogamy, and incest taboos, which she argues were all historically designed to protect property lines, ensure paternity, and maintain the father's power, become completely obsolete.
Right.
Human relationships can finally be based entirely on mutual consent, genuine affection, and shared interests, completely free from economic coercion or power dynamics.
And this leads to her alternative vision. If there is no traditional nuclear family, if no one is getting married in a church to legally bind their assets, how do we actually live day to day? She proposes the household of the future.
It is a fascinating, highly structured concept. She envisions voluntary, temporary contracts, perhaps lasting 7 to 10 years, between groups of consenting people.
These groups could be any mix of genders, and they're not necessarily romantically or sexually involved with everyone in the group.
Right. They are simply a collective. They choose to live together, they pool their resources, and if they gently choose to do so, they raise a cohort of children together.
And those children might be biologically related to some members, or they might be produced artificially or adopted. It wouldn't matter, because the very concept of bloodline ownership is completely removed.
It's like replacing a lifetime, high-pressure, inescapable mortgage with a flexible, community-based lease. She's trying to engineer a society where nobody owns anyone else.
A husband doesn't own a wife. A parent doesn't own a child.
It is a breathtaking vision of a society where the deepest, most fundamental division in nature, the biological inequality of men and women, is finally rendered meaningless by human ingenuity and radical political will. It is the ultimate triumph of conscious design over biological determinism.
Wow. Let's take a breath and try to synthesize this incredible arc we've just traveled. We started with a very modern question. Why are relationships today struggling so much?
And Firestone's answer is that they're struggling under the immense, crushing weight of an invisible, millennia-old power structure.
She looked past the arguments about money, she looked past the voting laws, and she pointed directly at human biology and the nuclear family as the engines of all human inequality.
She challenged us to see that what we consider natural is not necessarily just, and it is certainly not permanent. She took the analytical tools of Marx and Freud, stripped away their biases, and pushed them to their absolute, most radical limits.
And here's the final provocative thought I want to leave you with. Look around at the world today, right now. Birth rates are crashing globally in almost every developed nation.
Scientists are actively, successfully developing artificial womb technology for premature infants.
Alternative family structures, polyamory, and chosen communities are rising in popularity. Are we, right now, currently living through the chaotic, painful, messy middle stages of Firestone's 50-year-old prophecy?
It's a very real possibility.
I want you to look at your own family dynamics, look at your own memories of childhood, look at your own romantic ideals, the standards of beauty you hold yourself to, and what you expect from a partner. How much of it is actually your unique human nature, and how much of it is just a deeply ingrained structural power dynamic that you've been conditioned your entire life to call love?
It is a profound, deeply unsettling question. And once you ask it, once you see the architecture she maps out, it is almost impossible to unsee it.
Now, since the ultimate liberation of gender relations, in Firestone's view, relies so heavily on technology, this tipping point of cybernetics and artificial reproduction, do you want us to create a separate, incredibly detailed deep dive, specifically analyzing Firestone's views on technology, cybernetics, and the liberation of the female body?
There's so much more to unpack there.
If you want that deep dive into the science fiction turned reality aspect of her work, let us know. Thank you for joining us on this massive intellectual journey. Keep questioning the natural order of things. Keep looking for the invisible structures in your own life. We'll see you on the next deep dive.